Well, good morning and hello. Welcome to this session on delivering a path to net zero, hopefully with a building environment. My name is Azzeddine Oudjehane, and I welcome you from SAIT Southern Alberta Institute of Technology. Of course, I'm not in Paris, and these days I'm currently in Barcelona recording this video. So briefly who we are. SAIT Southern Alberta Institute of Technology College Polytechnic in Calgary, Alberta. You can see on the map in the western part of Canada, east of the Rockies. In the picture you have a view of our building on campus, the School of Construction, where I teach as part of the construction management program. So, and where we emphasize not only construction, but also building better, sustainable construction for the future of the planet. But myself, briefly, have been involved in many projects over the past 30 years with experience in primarily R&D and innovation. Also serving board director for EGCCC, Canadian Building Council for the Alberta chapter. Sustainability has always been a driver for my activities, and as a professor, as a trainer, as an educator, we try to bring the next generation to be conscientious about the planet and help them achieve the challenge that we are. Quickly, I would like to acknowledge a partnership that has enabled this. Part of this work focused on sustainability, working with the European partners on how to build better with mass timber, with wood, and achieve sustainable goals in a common goal. Right, the Europeans, Canada, and North America would all have that objective in mind and how to achieve it. So briefly today, what my talk will be this morning, focused around four key points. First of all, why are we here, and then how can we bring, or what are the impacts on the built environment, but also what are the trends? Are things changing in construction and globally? And lastly, suggestions for one path to achieve will be net zero, or hopefully maybe carbon negative by 2050. So why are we here? Well, the planet is burning. Facts are there. But before we get going, what I want to do is I'll address two polls throughout this session. Hopefully we can address them as my participating live. This would be a recording that we play during the time slot for my presentation. But the first question that I want to ask the audience here is net zero achievable by 2050? What are you thinking? What are your thoughts on that? And the audience is probably international here. Do you think that is something that we can achieve by 2050? To do the poll, the question again is, net zero achievable by 2050. You got two processes, two ways to do it. You have the QR code appearing here if you're using the phone device, or you can use a web browser going to www.menti.com and use the code showing on the slide, 78658815. I'll pause for a few seconds here to allow everybody to capture the code and the website, or use the QR code. Again, the question is simple: is net zero achievable by 2050 in your country, or what your thoughts are on that? Okay, thank you, and we'll discuss that during the live conversation. So really, the challenge we face is what kind of planet we want by 2030, by 2050. We want a hot planet burning. Climate change impacts are facts, and they're real, right? They're not hoax. Whether it's rainstorms, rain rivers, as we've seen them in some part of the world, drought, and just recently flooding in Pakistan, fires in California, right? We see these extreme weather patterns happening over the past decade, essentially, as a result of our human activities on the planet over the past 50, 60 years, particularly. A few weeks ago, I took this picture from a Canadian website, news website, reflecting on the world's map of fires as of August 2022. You can see it. Planet basically is red. It's in flames with really hot spots in there, where you can see. But I looked at it again through a NASA satellite image as of September 12, 2022. And what I think is interesting is like the southern hemisphere, which isn't supposed to be in summer in the hottest weather, is now on fire, all the red representing active fires in Africa and South America, with a lot of red dots in North America as part of California and the western part, where there really has been a hot, extreme hot weather. So that's real, that's happening. Going back 2 years ago, I'd like to highlight here and like this picture because it shows the impact of fire. So it's not only that the burning fires were emitting more carbon, but it has the impact on our air quality. This was taken in around Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, West Coast. September 7 was, hazy from fires, local fires, but on September 9, with wind coming from the south that year, was really bad in California and some parts of British Columbia as well. And you can see the air quality there, really bad for people. So, having that in mind, the net zero challenge that we have or faced is accelerate decarbonization worldwide, not just in Canada, not just in Europe, everywhere. And that's why we need a global perspective, as we are here at the Euro Global Climate Change Conference. We're trying to bring people from across the world to think and maybe hopefully act and walk the walk towards net zero. So can we achieve net zero with lowering the rising temperatures below the 2 degrees Celsius, which will be catastrophic by 2050? It is possible if we disrupt the way we build, the way we do our activities, use more renewable resources for energy, reduce our energy consumption. Right? So it's 2 ways. Again, we need to renew, we need to reduce, and we need to reuse. Right? So that's kind of the pattern. So if we can find solutions, innovations that are completely achievable and feasible. 30% reduction by 2050. Carbon neutral by 2050. That's the goal. That's where we're headed, and we have to do it. So, some other facts, really, when we're dealing with the construction sector, you look at what is the impact of the built environment. By 2050 plus, the world will see growth in population. And growth population means needing to build shelters, building homes, offices, places, infrastructure. And so within the next 30 plus years, 2.5 trillion square meters are expected of the new built environment. We're going to 230 billion square meters. That's global. That's what will happen across the planet to sustain living for people. What does that translate into? 230 million square meters over 30 years. That's building 1 terrace a year. A year per week. Right? So in short, 52 Paris towns, Paris cities, intramuros. For those of you in Paris who were supposed to be there, right, for the conference, but that's outside. The conference is supposed to be outside the boundaries of the city of Paris. But nevertheless, Paris is a big, big city. So imagine building 1 Paris a week for the next 30 years. That's a lot. I mean, of course, the argument can be made, well, how about we use existing infrastructure, existing stock of building? Well, is that possible? A good research team will ask students to investigate that eventually. But yeah, so that's what we're faced with. So how can we build those new buildings, those new projects, and achieve them to be carbon zero, carbon neutral? So the built environment, in fact, contributes to about 40% of the total CO2 emissions globally, right? 28 to 29% in the operation of buildings, projects, 11% 11%, 12% is in the manufacturing, is from the extraction of materials, manufacturing, processing, transportation, and construction. So from cradle to grave to gate until we deliver projects, and then beyond that is the other 28% of CO2 emissions to heating, cooling, lighting, and operation of the building. So, bring me to the definition of carbon footprint. I'm sure all of you are aware, but I just put here the definition of carbon footprint from the WHO, which is the impact that we have as human, our activities, daily activities, going to work, consuming, using facilities in our homes, traveling, etc. All of those have an impact which is measured in metric tons of CO2 equivalent carbon emission. So that's our carbon footprint, and we all have one. Conscientiously, I try to measure my carbon impact. For example, traveling to Paris for this conference would have been meant about 3 tons of CO2 just for my travel, one week or one round trip travel from Calgary to Paris return would have meant emitting 3 tons personally, just for me. Putting it in perspective of my heating and cooling emissions, use 2021 because it was carbon, and so that's the household for our home house, the carbon emissions resulting from heating in the winter, cold winters, and then summer a bit of cooling or very less because homes are not necessarily air conditioned in that part of Canada. Nevertheless, you can see 2.5, even if it's household and divided by 2, and that's 125. That's half what just one trip from Calgary to Paris would emit in CO2. So of course there are ways to offset, but first of all, we need to all individually be responsible, but at least be aware of our impact, individual impact in our daily life. When we know what we're emitting, what we're consuming, we can eventually transition into a healthier and less polluting aspect. Which brings me to my first path towards a net zero, is creating that awareness. As an educator, as a trainer working with students and with colleagues, is trying with industry partners, is creating that awareness, sharing the information that we all have responsibility in our carbon footprint. That awareness is the first step towards a smooth transition and a possible transition and acceptance of the change to new ways to build, to do our business. So what are the trends? I've selected to go through global corporation, Microsoft. As you can see in this slide, the path of Microsoft towards carbon negative, actually, 2030. Microsoft is expected to be carbon negative by 2030, and by 2050, reverse all the carbon emissions emitted from the early 1980s. Similarly, Google is stating that they are carbon neutral, and they have been for the past 10 years because they rely primarily on renewable resources for their energy consumption for offices, headquarters. So the other example I have is Walmart. Walmart's path to net zero. Walmart path to net zero by 2040. With all activities, diversity, and services and goods. Google, Amazon committing to being carbon neutral by 2040 and has committed to purchasing 100,000 vehicles by the end of this year or next year, and then enabling use of renewable again for distribution and so on. So how can we build, how can the build environment sector go green and net zero? Some examples, we talk about corporations, and that's where I'm bringing to my second poll and second question, because it will relate to materials. What is your preferred building material? What do you like to use in your country or places of activities and businesses? And the question will be directed around three building materials and apologies for that. So you could be using bricks or cement and concrete. Relate that to concrete. So your options are wood, steel, or concrete. And to do so, question is again, what is your preferred building material? To do that, you have the QR code, and I'll pause again for a few seconds. www.menti.com using the code 66351344. All right, so we talked about the carbon emissions or GHG emissions from the building sector, contribution 29% in operation, and the rest in embodied carbon to the manufacturing and construction. So how can we look at that? For those of you who have chosen concrete as your building material, I'm not sure if you're aware, but sand, which is a major component of concrete, is the third largest resources in the world after air and water extracted from the planet. So, and by 2030, it is expected that there'll be a very shortage of sand to be used in concrete. But in the context of environment and pollution, concrete industry pollutes 4 times more than the airline industry. Talking about airline industry, a few days ago, I heard that Canada is purchasing electrical hybrid airplanes, again, to reduce that impact. So, shipping industry, 5%, concrete industry, 8%. So if we can target to reduce that emission even for concrete, that's the challenge towards the concrete industry to reduce the use of fossil fuel, find alternative, innovative approaches, manufacturing processes to use alternate materials to cement and achieve that goal of reducing it by half. Even if we can achieve half of that, it will be a good objective to achieve by 2030, by 2050. So what are the trends in the construction? We just started with construction, cement, industry, concrete industry. We talked about corporation. Now I'm going to use a little bit of a local company, Canadian Chandos Construction, with a goal to be net zero by 2040. And part of the commitment is changing the way they do business, forcing and fostering that their contractors, their suppliers, abide by the same goal. Otherwise, they won't do business with them. So again, that's a driver by trying to drag also the suppliers related sectors to construction to be also carbon neutral and be net zero by a certain date, 2040 ideally. I talked about Walmart. Why Walmart? Walmart is building headquarters south in the States, and part of their goal is to build a large campus for training for offices using sustainable green building material, wood in general. Right? Of course, it's not 100%, but it will have concrete and steel, but the predominant material will be wood to offset all the emissions or carbon emissions from other material sources and methods. So, wood is trending indeed, right? Every week we hear, or every month at least, we hear about new projects using wood, and up to the extent that wood has become the building material of the future as being the priority. It has been the race, and we can go through a few impacts here, interactive maps for building projects across Canada using mass timber growth, 400 projects over the past 3 years. The growth is even larger in the United States. We mentioned Google, Amazon, Walmart, Microsoft building exclusively using mass timber. 1,400 projects and their construction were planned for the next year or so. That's as of 2022. A huge expansion, and that's really one of the largest in the world. They're using wood as the primary building material. As of course, the race to build taller with wood. Why build taller is essentially to showcase the capacity of wood to achieve those goals and substitute to other less green or less sustainable friendly materials. This was the start in Vancouver, British Columbia, with the University of British Columbia, taking a story told with primarily using mass timber, glulam, and CLT with concrete for foundations or main podium floor, as well as the elevated shafts, and as you can see in the picture, steel connections. So it is hybrid, but it's predominantly using wood as the building material. Going around the globe for Vienna, another tall building, using less timber. And then, that race to building taller comes out the luxury building in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the tallest now today, completed a few months ago. And you can see in this picture the glass wall curtain. However, the structure is all wood, CLT, and glulam, if I recall. So again, the hybrid and then 4-story concrete podium with parking. Concept other buildings in Sydney, Australia. This is planned for 2050, but greenery, making it a very sustainable construction. Again, that's the trend we observe in the construction sector. But why build with both? Well, every time I ask a question, it's around sustainability, but environmental impact, also like constructability, so we have to match, for businesses, be productive, also as well as being sustainable. So looking at the life cycle impact. So to make a sustainable case for wood building, we looked at the return from COVID, conscientious about the indoor environment, the health impact that buildings have, and how for a year or two, the world has very low or lowered its impact on carbon. So we want to continue that trend. I found that to understanding carbon, we have two concepts. The one of embodied carbon, which is from, again, cradle to gate, and then from gate to cradle, or at least to the reuse of the building at the end of its life cycle. The two are important. They contribute differently. We can control the operation by changing the renewable resources, but the embodied carbon has up until now not considered as often as possible, and that's really the focus of the construction sector these days, and that's where the change of material comes into play. So what is operation carbon is that one used throughout the life cycle of the building, so from the delivery until its end of life, or reusability ideally. The embodied carbon is that one, is the one from the manufacturing process, from cradle to gate. So here's an approach of depicting the environmental impact. So if we remember talking about the projection of 230 million square meters. So if we start from 2020 to 2050, the impact highlighted in green here for building operation up to 2050. By 2050, embodied carbon depicted in yellow will represent about 49% of the carbon emissions. So if we can manage to reduce the energy use of our buildings for heating, for cooling, finding alternatives, we can certainly reduce the impact. But more importantly, if we were to take off the yellow curve to zero, then by 2050, we will have less or negative impact. And that's kind of the path that we propose as a path to net zero in construction or in the built environment. A little bit in an inventory of CO2 emissions by material. You can see here from aluminum to the lowest in stone. Right? What we can notice here is natural materials have loss of environmental impact. And one material that we don't see in this list is wood. Because in fact, why build with wood? Because it is a carbon sink. 1 cubic meter of forest or tree is equivalent to 1 ton of why it is the preferred material as a carbon sink. Now, when it comes down to systems and net carbon emissions for construction, in this chart, what we have is the net carbon emissions, including processing. Right? As you can see, from negative carbon impact for lumber, pieces of wood cut from trees, or even CLD, which has a little bit processing and thereby some emissions, it still have a net negative emission. Compare that to masonry or to steel recycled versus that of virgin steel, which is the largest in terms of construction system. So we did the poll before. I'm going to ask you the same question if you change to mine on the preferred material. Continuing on our path to net zero built environment, what we are looking at, again, through a simulation similar to that chart that I displayed a few slides ago. What we have here is, what if we use carbon neutral or carbon negative material, right? The embodied is negative. And if we can manage, or even if we would use the impact over the next 35, 40 years with our emissions through the building operation and maintenance, by the time we get to 2050, that will be offset by the embodied carbon that we have in the material. So the building will be at least carbon neutral, if not negative, depending on the construction type and so on. So that's the path we're suggesting on using negative carbon materials at the start and having the embodied being negative so that it can offset the total. So we looked at it for simulation for a 10-story building here, highlighted in the left. And of course, the question that has always been asked is, okay, we can do that in Canada, we can do that in North America and parts of Europe where trees are available. What about the rest of the world? How can we sustain that? A 10-story building like this would require about 390 trees. So that may sound a lot or less, and the forest has to also be sustainably managed. So we cut a tree, we plant a tree to maintain and making it sustainable. Of course, in countries like Canada, that's possible. But when we're looking at the EUIs, the operation and maintenance, we compared our buildings, two buildings for Calgary weather using concrete versus wood. The buildings perform more or less similarly. A bit of advantage to a concrete building because of its thermal mass, but nothing significant. So in this case, the whole building operation is reliance on the source of energy. We use renewables, solar, wind, other types of non-fossil fuel to heat, cool, enable electricity and energy. That's the key, because the buildings will perform equally the same if you use one material versus another. The biggest difference is in the embodied part. As we have seen so far, wood being a carbon sink will enable taking off CO2 from the project and from the building. For example, our 10-story would be benefit of 2,350 tons, metric tons of CO2 that are not going into the atmosphere. And that's the biggest advantage that wood construction would have. We looked at the impact of other similar in comparison. So if we do a light frame building, 6-story, 12,000 square feet, what type of alternative methods can we do? We did it with light frame using small pieces of wood with a carbon benefit of 350, 60 tons. And then we looked at it using mass timber, glue lamp, CLT, because wood is massive. In this case, solid wood, we have a larger reduction in our benefit and the carbon emissions. In this case, 600, twice more. But the cost may be consequent. And then, creating that awareness is key to bringing everybody on board and moving the disruptive change for the way we build. So, last few words, the key takeaway. Is the building environment or the built environment can it be achieving the net zero goal? Yes, that's my goal and my hope, and we can continue that because through using alternatives such as mass timber, we can certainly achieve that in addition to other benefits to indoor air quality. We spend more than 9% of our time indoor. We did spend 100% of our time indoor during the pandemic, and so it is important that both our indoor air quality and our outdoor air quality may remain clean and healthy for the humanity over the next 20 to 30 years. On that, I'll thank you for your attention. I'll be happy to entertain questions live, and if you want to reach me, here's my